friends as possible. Chapter 6. Learning to like school. Life at Lowood no longer seemed so hard as spring approached. We enjoyed walking and playing in the surrounding countryside. But with fog lying constantly in the valley, it was not a healthy place for a school. And by May, more than half the girls were seriously ill with typhus fever. As a result of poor food and bad living conditions, many girls died. While there was fear and death inside the school, the sun shone on the flowers outside and on the flowing streams in the valleys. So I and the few who had escaped illness enjoyed the beautiful summer weather, with no lessons or discipline at all. Helen Burns could not come walking with me because she was ill, not with typhus, but with tuberculosis. At first I had thought she would recover, but when I learned her illness was serious, I decided to visit her at night for what might be the last time. I found her lying in bed, looking pale and weak. "You've come to say goodbye," she whispered, coughing. "You're just in time. I'm going soon." "Where, Helen? Are you going home?" I asked. "Yes, to my long home, my last home." No, Helen." I was crying at the thought of losing her. "Jane, your feet are cold. Lie down with me and cover them with my blanket." I did so. "I'm happy, Jane," she continued. "You mustn't cry. By dying young, I'll avoid suffering. I'm going to heaven." "Does heaven really exist?" I asked. "Yes, I'm sure of it. I'm sure our souls go there when we die," she answered firmly. "Will I see you again, Helen, when I die?" "Yes, you will go to heaven too, Jane." I could not quite believe that heaven existed, and I held tightly to Helen. I did not want to let her go. We kissed goodnight and fell asleep. In the morning, Miss Temple found me asleep with Helen Burns dead in my arms. She was buried in the local churchyard. Gradually, the typhus fever left Lowood, but the number of deaths made the public aware of the poor conditions in which the pupils lived. Money was raised to build a new school in a better position. Many improvements were made, and Mr. Brocklehurst lost his position as manager. So it became a really useful place of education. I stayed for 8 more years, for the last 2 as a teacher. I was busy and happy all that time, relying greatly on the help and encouragement of my dear friend Miss Temple. But when she married and moved to a distant part of the country, I decided it was the moment for me to change my life too. I realized I had never known any other world apart from Lowood or Gateshead. Suddenly I wanted freedom, or at least a new master to serve. So I advertised in a newspaper for a job as a governess. When I received an answer from a Mrs. Fairfax, who wanted a governess for a girl under 10 years old, I accepted, with the permission of the new headmistress of Lowood. Part 3. A Governess at Thornfield. Chapter 7. Thornfield and Mr. Rochester. Thornfield Hall was a large gentleman's house in the country, near a town called Millcote. There, after my 16-hour journey, I was welcomed by Mrs. Fairfax. She was a little old lady, dressed in black, who seemed glad to have someone else to talk to apart from the servants. Although the house was dark and frightening, with its big rooms full of heavy furniture, I was excited at being in a new place and looked forward to my new life there, working for kind Mrs. Fairfax. But I was surprised to discover on my first full day at Thornfield that Mrs. Fairfax was not in fact the owner, as I had assumed, but the housekeeper, and that my new master was a Mr. Rochester, who was often away from home. My pupil was a girl called Adele, 7 or 8 years old, who was born in France and could hardly speak English. Luckily, I had learnt French very well at Lowood, and had no difficulty in communicating with young Adele, a pretty, cheerful child. It appeared that Mr. Rochester, who had known Adele and her mother very well, had brought Adele back to England to live with him after her mother had died. I taught her for several hours every day in the library, although it was not easy to make her concentrate on anything for long, as she was clearly not used to the discipline of lessons. One day, I took the opportunity of asking Mrs. Fairfax a few questions about Mr. Rochester, as I was curious about him, and the little housekeeper seemed happy to talk. "Is he liked by most people?" was my first question.
"Oh, yes. His family have always been respected here. They've owned the land round here for years," she replied.
"But do you like him? What is his character like?"
"I've always liked him, and I think he's a fair master to his servants. He's a little peculiar, perhaps. He's travelled a lot, you know. I expect he's clever, but I can't tell, really."
"What do you mean, peculiar?" I asked, interested.
"It's not easy to describe. You're never sure whether he's serious or joking. You don't really understand him, at least I don't. But that doesn't matter. He's a very good master."
I could get no further information from Mrs. Fairfax about Mr. Rochester, but instead she offered to show me round the whole house. We went through many large, impressive rooms, finally reaching the top floor, where there was a narrow corridor with several small black doors, all shut. I stopped to look at them, and thought for a moment they looked like prison doors, hiding evil secrets. No sooner had I turned away to go downstairs than I heard a strange, ghostly laugh. "Mrs. Fairfax?" I called out, as the housekeeper was already on her way downstairs. "Did you hear that laugh? Who is it?"
"It may be Grace Poole," she answered calmly. "She's paid to help the housemaid in her work, and always sews in one of those rooms."
I heard the laugh again. It did not sound human to me. "Grace!" called Mrs. Fairfax. I did not expect anyone to answer, but in fact a door opened, and a middle-aged woman appeared. She looked too plain and sensible to be a ghost.
"Too much noise, Grace," said Mrs. Fairfax. "Remember your instructions."
Grace nodded and went back into the room. Several times in the next few months, I went up to the top floor again, where I could look out of the high windows in the roof to see the surrounding countryside and be alone with my thoughts. I was very happy teaching pretty little Adele in the daytime and talking to kind old Mrs. Fairfax in the evening. But I felt that something was missing from my life. I had dreams of a greater and better life, and above all, I wanted to do more. People are not always satisfied with a quiet life, and women as well as men need action. While on the top floor, I often heard Grace Poole's strange laugh, and sometimes I saw her too. She used to go silently in and out of the room with a plate of food or a glass of beer. One day in January, I had a free afternoon, as Adele was ill, so I decided to walk to Hay, a village 2 miles away, to post a letter for the housekeeper. It was a bright, frosty day, and I was enjoying the fresh air and the exercise. Stopping on the lonely road, I watched the sun go down in the trees behind Thornfield, and then in the silence I heard a horse approaching. Suddenly there was a crash as the horse slipped and fell on the ice, bringing down its rider. I ran to see if I could help the traveller, who was swearing furiously as he pulled himself free of the horse. "Are you hurt, sir? Can I do anything?" I asked.
"Just stand back," he growled,
and he lifted himself painfully to his feet. Obviously his leg hurt him, and he sat down quickly. "If you need help, sir, I can fetch someone either from Thornfield Hall or from Hay," I offered.
"Thank you, but I don't need anyone. I haven't broken any bones," he replied crossly.
I could see him clearly in the moonlight. He was of medium height, with wide shoulders and a strong chest. He had a dark face with angry-looking eyes and was about 35. If he had been a young, attractive gentleman, I would have been too shy to offer help, but as he was not handsome and even quite rough, I felt I wanted to help him. "I can't leave you, sir, so late on this lonely road till I see you're fit enough to get on your horse," I insisted. He looked at me for the first time when I said this. "I think you ought to be at home yourself," he answered. "Do you live near here?" "In that house over there," I said, "and I'm not at all afraid of being out at night. I'm just going to Hay to post a letter, and I'll be happy to take a message for you."
"You live in that house?" he asked,
surprised, pointing to Thornfield Hall, which was lit up in the moonlight. "Yes, sir," I replied.
"Whose house is it?"
he asked. "Mr. Rochester's."
"Do you know Mr. Rochester?"
was his next question. "No, I've never seen him," I answered.
"You aren't a servant at Thornfield Hall, of course. You must be—"
He hesitated, looking at my plain black dress. He seemed puzzled to know who I was, so I helped him. "I'm the governess."
"Oh, the governess. I had forgotten."
He tried to get up, but his leg was still hurting him badly.
"I don't want you to fetch help, but you can help me yourself if you like."
"Of course, sir," I said. And so he leaned his weight on my shoulder, and I helped him walk to his horse. In a moment he had jumped on the horse's back.
"Thank you. Now take your letter to Hay, then hurry home," he called as he rode off into the distance.
I walked on, glad to have helped someone, to have done something active for once. In my mind, I saw that dark, strong face, and I still felt excited by our meeting. Even when I arrived back at Thornfield, I'd go in a while. I did not want the dark house, where I'd spend the evening quietly with old Mrs. Fairfax. So I stayed outside, stared at the moon and the stars with a beating heart, wishing, dreaming of a different, more exciting. When I entered, the servants told me that Mr. Rochester had arrived, and that he had hurt his leg when his horse slipped on ice on the road to Hay. Chapter 8. Getting to know Mr. Rochester. Thornfield Hall became quite busy the next day, now that the master had returned. People kept coming to visit him on business. I enjoyed the new, cheerful atmosphere, but I could not make Adele concentrate on her lessons, because she was constantly talking about the presents Mr. Rochester had promised to bring her. That evening, we were invited to have tea with him. I immediately recognized the traveller I had helped, with his dark hair and skin, his square forehead, and his stern look. His leg was supported on a chair, but he made no effort to greet me when I entered. In fact, he neither spoke nor moved. "Have you brought a present for Miss Eyre with you as well?" Adele asked him.
"A present? Who wants a present?"
he said angrily. "Did you expect a present, Miss Eyre? Do you like presents?" "I haven't much experience of them, sir," I answered. "Anyway, I have no right to expect a present, as I haven't done anything to deserve one." "Don't be so modest. I've been talking to Adele. She's not very clever, but you've taught her well." "Sir, that is my present. That's what a teacher wants most, praise of her pupil's progress." Mr. Rochester drank his tea in silence. After tea, he called me closer to the fire while Adele played with Mrs. Fairfax. "Where were you before you came here?" he asked. "I was at Lowood School, sir, for 8 years. "Ah, yes, a charity school. 8 years. I'm surprised you lasted so long in such a place. There is something like magic in your face. When I met you on the road to Hay last night, I almost thought you had put a spell on my horse. I still wonder if you did. What about your parents?" "They're dead. I don't remember them." "And your relations?" "I have none." "Who recommended you to come here?" "I advertised, and Mrs. Fairfax answered the advertisement." "Yes," said the old housekeeper, "and I thank God she did. She's a good teacher for Adele and a kind friend to me." "Don't try to give her a good character, Mrs. Fairfax," said Mr. Rochester sternly. "She and her magic made my horse slip on the ice last night." Mrs. Fairfax looked puzzled and clearly did not understand. "Miss Eyre," continued Mr. Rochester, "how old were you when you started at Lowood?" "About 10. "And you stayed there 8 years, so you're now 18. I nodded. "I would never have been able to guess your age," he went on. "Now, what did you learn there? Can you play the piano?" "A little." "Of course, that's what all young women say. Go and play a tune on the piano in the library." I did as he asked. "That's enough," he called after a few minutes. "Yes, you do indeed play a little, just like any schoolgirl. Better than some, perhaps. Now, bring me your sketches." I fetched them from my room. Having looked carefully at them, he chose 3. "These are interesting," he said. "You have only expressed the shadow of your ideas because you aren't good enough at drawing or painting. But the ideas, where did they come from? Who taught you to draw wind and space and feeling? But put them away now, Miss Eyre. Do you realise it's 9 o'clock? Adele should be in bed by now. Good night to you all." Mr. Rochester's mood had suddenly changed, and he clearly wished to be alone. Later that evening, I talked to Mrs. Fairfax. "You said Mr. Rochester was a little peculiar," I said. "What do you think, Miss Eyre?" "I think he's very peculiar and quite rude." "He may seem like that to a stranger. I'm so used to him that I never notice it. And he has had family troubles, you know." "But he has no family," I answered. "Not now, that's true. But he did have an older brother who died 9 years ago." 9 years is a long time. Surely he has recovered from losing his brother by now.
Well, there was a lot of bad feeling in the family. The father was very fond of money and wanted to keep the family property together. So the elder brother inherited most of it. I don't know what happened, but I do know Mr. Edward, that's the master, quarrelled with his family. That's why he's travelled so much. When his brother died, he inherited Thornfield, but I'm not surprised he doesn't come here often."
"Why should he stay away?" I asked, surprised.
"Perhaps he thinks it's a sad place. I really don't know."
It was clear that Mrs. Fairfax would not tell me any more. One evening, a few days later, I was invited to talk to Mr. Rochester after dinner. At the far end of the room, Adele was delightedly telling Mrs. Fairfax about the presents she had received. Mr. Rochester called me closer to the fire. "I don't like the conversation of children or old ladies," he murmured to me. "But they are entertaining each other at the moment, so I can amuse myself." Tonight he did not look so stern, and there was a softness in his fine dark eyes. As I was looking at him, he suddenly turned and caught my look. "Do you think I'm handsome, Miss Eyre?" he asked. Normally I would have taken time to think and said something polite, but somehow I answered at once. No, sir. You really are unusual. You are a quiet, serious little person, but you can be almost rude. Sir, I'm sorry. I should have said that beauty doesn't matter or something like that. No, you shouldn't. I see you criticize my appearance and then you stab me in the back. All right, tell me, what is wrong with my appearance? Mr. Rochester, I didn't intend to criticize you. Well, now you can. Look at my head. Do you think I'm intelligent? He pointed to his huge square forehead. I do, sir. Is it rude to ask if you're also good? Stabbing me again. Just because I said I didn't like talking to old ladies and children. Well, young lady, I wanted to be good when I was younger, but life has been a struggle for me, and I've become as hard and tough as a rubber ball. I only have a little goodness left inside. He was speaking rather excitedly, and I thought perhaps he'd been drinking. Miss Eyre, you look puzzled. Tonight I want conversation. It's your turn. Speak. I said nothing, but smiled coldly. I'm sorry if I'm rude, Miss Eyre, but I'm 20 years older and more experienced than you. Don't you think I have the right to command you? No, sir, not just because you're older and more experienced than me. You would have the right only if you'd made good use of your experience of life. I don't accept that, as I've made very bad use of my experience. But will you agree to obey my orders anyway? I thought, he is peculiar. He's forgotten that he's paying me £30 a year to obey his orders, and I said, Not many masters bother to ask if their servants are offended by their orders. Of course, I'd forgotten that I pay you a salary. So will you agree because of the salary? No, sir. Not because of that, but because you forgot about it, and because you care whether a servant of yours is comfortable or not. I gladly agree. You have honesty and feeling. There are not many girls like you, but perhaps I go too fast. Perhaps you have awful faults to counterbalance your few good points. And perhaps you have too, I thought. He seemed to read my mind and said quickly, Yes, you're right. I have plenty of faults. I went the wrong way when I was 21 and have never found the right path again. I might have been very different. I might have been as good as you and perhaps wiser. I'm not a bad man, take my word for it, but I have done wrong. It wasn't my character, but circumstances which were to blame. Why do I tell you all this? Because you're the sort of person people tell their problems and secrets to. Because you're sympathetic and give them hope. Do you think so, sir? I do. You see, when life was difficult, I became desperate, and now all I have is regret. Asking forgiveness might cure it, sir. No, it won't. What I really should do is change my character, and I still could, but it's difficult. And if I can't have happiness, I want pleasure, even if it's wrong. Pleasure may taste bitter, sir. How do you know? A pure young thing like you. You have no experience of life and its problems. But I will try to lead a better life. I stood up. The conversation was becoming hard to follow. I must put Adele to bed now, I said. Don't be afraid of me, Miss Eyre. You don't relax or laugh very much, perhaps because of the effect Lowood School has had on you. But in time, you will be more natural with me, and laugh and speak freely. You're like a restless bird in a cage. When you get out of the cage, you'll fly very high. Good night. Chapter 9. Mr. Rochester's Past. Soon I discovered what Mr. Rochester meant when he said he had done wrong. One afternoon, while walking in the gardens of Thornfield, he told me the story of his love affair in Paris with a French dancer, Céline. Yes, Miss Eyre, I was young and foolish then. I was so in love with her that I rented a house and hired servants for her. I gave her a carriage and jewels. In fact, I threw away a fortune on her, just like any fool in love. One evening I visited her, but found she was out, so I waited on her balcony smoking a cigar. I heard her carriage arriving. Imagine my horror at seeing her step out, followed by a man. You're so young. You've never felt love or jealousy, have you, Miss Eyre? You're floating along a quiet river now. You don't see the water boiling at the foot of the great rocks. But one day you'll come to a point in life's stream where the wild force of the waves may destroy you, where the noisy, rushing water may drown you. I'm calm enough now, calm enough to like living here at Thornfield. I like it because it's old and grey and dark, and yet I hate... He did not finish what he was saying, staring angrily up at the windows on the top floor of his house. It was a look of disgust, pain, and shame. I could not understand what he meant, and wanted to hear more about Celine, so I encouraged him to finish the story. What happened when she entered the house, sir? Oh, I'd forgotten Celine. By the way, it's strange my telling you all this, but I know my secret's safe with you. And I know, too, that it can't have an evil influence on you. Your mind's too strong for that. Yes, I listened to her conversation with her lover, an elegant young fool, and I knew I was no longer in love with her. So I walked into the room, told her our relationship was over, and challenged her lover to fight me. Next day I shot him in the arm during our fight, thought that was the end of the whole thing, and left France. But a few months before, Celine had had a baby girl, Adele, and she claimed that Adele was my child. She may be, although I doubt it. So when, a few years later, Celine abandoned Adele and ran away to Italy with a singer, I went to Paris and brought Adele back to grow up in England. I felt proud that Mr. Rochester had trusted me with the story of his past life. I thought a lot about his character, and although I was aware of his faults, I also saw his goodness and kindness to me. From now on, my happiest moments were spent with him. I could not have imagined a better companion. One night I was woken by a slight noise. I felt sure someone was outside my bedroom door. As I hurried to lock it, I called, "Who's there?" There was a strange, inhuman sound. Then I heard a door shut upstairs on the top floor. Was that Grace Poole? I wondered, trembling. My curiosity made me open the door, and I found the corridor full of smoke. I saw it was coming from Mr. Rochester's door, which was slightly open. I completely forgot my fears and rushed into his room. He lay fast asleep, surrounded by flames and smoke. Even his sheets were on fire. "Wake up! Wake up!" I shouted desperately, throwing water over him to put out the flames. Not until the fire was almost out did he wake up, swearing to find himself so wet. "Is there a flood?" he cried. "No, sir," I answered, "but there's been a fire." "Jane Eyre, is it you and your magic?" he asked. "Have you put a spell on me again? Did you intend to drown me this time?" "Please get up, sir. Someone has plotted to kill you." And I explained what I had heard and how I'd put out the fire. He looked very serious and thought for a few seconds. "Shall I fetch Mrs. Fairfax, sir, or the servants?" I asked. "No, why bother them? Just stay here for a moment. I'm going up to the top floor. Don't call anyone. I'll be back soon." I waited, cold and tired, in his room for what seemed a very long time. Then I saw the light of his candle approaching through the darkness, and he appeared, looking pale and depressed. "Did you see anything when you opened your bedroom door?" he asked, glancing sharply at me. "No, sir. Only a candle on the floor." "But you heard a strange laugh, did you say?" "Yes, I've heard it before. Grace Poole laughs like that." "That's it. It must have been Grace Poole. You've guessed it. I shall consider what to do about it. But meanwhile, I'm glad you're the only person who knows anything about all this. Say nothing to anybody else, and now go back to your own room." "Good night, then, sir," I said, moving towards the door. "What, are you leaving me already?" he said, seeming surprised, although he had just told me to go. "And so coldly?" "You said I should go, sir." "But not without saying goodbye. Not without a kind word or two. Why, you've saved my life. I hate being in debt to anyone, but with you it's different, Jane. I'm happy to owe you my life." His voice was trembling as he took both my hands in his. "I knew when I first saw you that you would do me good. I saw it in your eyes when I met you. I was right to like your smile and the magic in your face." There was energy in his voice and a strange light in his eyes. "I'm glad I happened to be awake," I said, "but I must go now. I'm cold." I knew I could not control my feelings much longer, and I needed time to think. But he still held on to my hands. Then I thought of a way of escaping. "I think I hear the servants moving, sir," I said. "Well, leave me," he said, and let me go. That night, or what was left of it, I could not sleep. My mind was full of confusing pictures and disturbed emotions. Chapter 10. The Mystery of Grace Poole. After this sleepless night, I was eager to see Mr. Rochester in the morning, but there was no sign of him. He'd obviously told the servants that he had accidentally set fire to his room by knocking over a lighted candle. As I passed his bedroom, I saw Grace Poole sitting inside, calmly mending the curtains. She certainly did not look desperate or mad enough to have tried to murder her master, but I decided to investigate. "Good morning, Grace," I said, entering the room. "Tell me what happened last night. The servants are talking about it." "Good morning, miss," she replied, looking up innocently. "Well, master was reading in bed and fell asleep, so he must have knocked the candle over. It set fire to the sheets, but luckily he managed to put the flames out with some water." "How strange," I said quietly. "Didn't anybody hear what was happening?" At this, she seemed to examine me carefully. "Mrs. Fairfax and you sleep nearest this room, miss. Mrs. Fairfax is a heavy sleeper, like most old people, and didn't hear anything. But you're young, miss. Perhaps you heard a noise." "I did," I whispered. "I'm sure I heard a strange laugh." She went on sewing calmly. "I don't think master would have laughed when he was in such danger," she said. "You must have been dreaming." "No, I wasn't dreaming," I replied sharply. "You didn't think of opening your door and looking out into the corridor?" she asked. I suddenly realized that if she suspected I knew of her guilt, she might attack me. "No. In fact, I locked my door," I answered, "and I shall lock it every night from now on." "That's wise of you, miss. We might have burglars at Thornfield one day. You never know." I was amazed by her self-control, and could not understand why Mr. Rochester had not asked the police to arrest her, or at least dismissed her from his service. Why had he asked me to keep the attack a secret? How could such a proud gentleman be so much in the power of one of his servants that he could not even punish her for trying to kill him? Did she know a terrible secret from his past, which she had threatened to tell? Could he ever have been in love with her? No, I thought. He could never love anyone as plain and coarse as she is. But then I'm not beautiful either, and I sometimes think he loves me. Last night, his words, his look, his voice, and my cheeks were red as I thought of those precious moments. I was now even more impatient to see Mr. Rochester, but when I was having tea with Mrs. Fairfax in the afternoon, the first thing she said was, "It's fine weather for the master's journey." "Journey?" I cried. "I didn't know he'd gone anywhere."
Oh, yes. He went off just after breakfast to visit a family in a big house about 16 miles away. I know they've invited a lot of guests who'll be staying in the house. Mr. Rochester is always very popular with the ladies at these parties, so he may not come back for a week or so. Who are the ladies at this house party? 3 sisters. Very elegant young ladies, and their friends, Blanche and Mary Ingram. But Blanche is the most beautiful of all. I saw when she came to a Christmas party at Thornfield 6 or 7 years ago. What does she look like? She was 18 then. A lovely girl, with beautiful skin, long curling black hair, and fine black eyes which shone as brightly as her jewels. She looked like a queen. All the gentlemen admired her, not only for her beauty, but also for her musical skills. When she and Mr. Rochester sang together, it was a delight to hear. Mr. Rochester? I didn't know he could sing. Oh, yes, he has a very fine voice. And then she played the piano later. The master said she played extremely well. And this beautiful lady isn't married yet? No, I don't think she or her sister has much money. But I'm surprised some rich gentleman hasn't fallen in love with her. Mr. Rochester, for example. He's rich, isn't he? Oh, yes. But you see, there's a considerable difference in age. He's nearly 40, and she's only 25. Well, marriages like that happen every day. Do you think... But I was interrupted by Adele, who came to join us, and the subject was changed. That night in my room, I was stern with myself. You, Jane Eyre, I accused my reflection in the mirror, you are the biggest fool in the world. How could you imagine that a gentleman of family and wealth would love you, a plain little governess? Just look at yourself. And I decided that next day I would draw an honest sketch of myself and then one of Blanche Ingram, painting the most lovely face I could imagine, according to Mrs. Fairfax's description. In the future, if ever my old feelings about Mr. Rochester began to return, I would only have to glance at the 2 pictures to see the great difference between us, and in this way common sense would destroy my foolish dreams. Chapter 11. The Thornfield House Party. 2 disappointing weeks passed before we heard from Mr. Rochester again. During this time, I tried hard to forget my feeling for him. I reminded myself that he paid me to teach Adele, nothing more, and that no other relationship could exist between us. When his letter finally came, Mrs. Fairfax announced with great excitement that he was planning a house party at Thornfield. He was going to return in 3 days' time and had invited a large number of ladies and gentlemen to stay for several days. We all worked extremely hard in the next few days, cleaning all the rooms and preparing the food. The only person in the house who did not appear excited was Grace Poole, who stayed in her room upstairs, coming down once a day for food and drink. None of the servants seemed at all curious about her, but I once heard 2 of the maids talking, and I listened when I caught her name. "Does Grace Poole earn a lot, then?" asked one. "Yes, 5 times what you and I earn," answered the other. "But she's good at the work, I expect," said the first. "Oh, she understands what she has to do, that's true," answered the second. "And not everyone will want to do her job, not even for all that money." "Quite right. I wonder whether the master—" Suddenly they saw me and broke off their conversation. "Doesn't she know?" I heard one of them whisper. "No," said the other, and they were silent. So I realized there was a secret at Thornfield which nobody wanted to tell me. At last the great day came. Everything was ready for the master and his guests. Adele and I watched from an upstairs window as the carriages arrived. In front rode Mr. Rochester on his black horse,
and with him rode a beautiful lady, her black curls streaming in the wind. Blanche Ingram, I thought. We listened to the laughing and talking in the hall as the guests were welcomed by their host and his housekeeper. From a dark corner of the stairs, we admired the ladies as they went up to their rooms, and then again as they descended to dinner in their elegant evening dresses. Adele was hoping Mr. Rochester would call her down to meet the guests, but in the end she was so tired with all the excitement that she and I both went to bed early. Next morning, after breakfast, the whole group went out for the day. Again I saw Mr. Rochester and Blanche Ingram riding together. I pointed this out to Mrs. Fairfax. You see, Mr. Rochester clearly prefers her to any of the other ladies.
Yes, he does seem to admire her,
admitted the housekeeper. And she admires him. Notice how she looks at him? But I haven't really seen her face yet. I'd like to.
You'll see her tonight, answered Mrs. Fairfax. I mentioned to the master that Adele wanted to be introduced to the ladies, and he asked you to bring her down to meet them this evening.
Well, I'll go if he wants me to, but I don't like meeting strangers. I'm not used to it.
I understand how you feel, said the old lady kindly, but the guests won't notice you much, and you can easily escape after a short time.
So Adele and I, dressed in our best, were waiting as the ladies came into the sitting-room after dinner. I was most impressed by the beauty and elegance of all of them, but was especially fascinated by the Ingram family. Lady Ingram, although between 40 and 50, was still a fine woman. Her hair still looked black, by candlelight at least, and her teeth still seemed perfect. But she had fierce, proud eyes that reminded me of Aunt Reed's, and a hard, powerful voice. Her daughter Mary was rather quiet, but her other daughter Blanche was very different. As soon as the gentlemen came into the room and coffee was served, she became the centre of attention. She played the piano excellently, she sang sweetly, she discussed intelligently, and all the time her flashing eyes, rich black curls, and fine figure attracted glances from every gentleman in the room. But I was looking for someone else. The last time I'd seen him, on the night of the fire, he had held my hands, told me I had saved his life, and looked at me as if he loved me. How close we had been then. But now he entered the room without even looking at me, and took a seat with the ladies. I could not stop looking at him, rather like a thirsty man who knows the water is poisoned but cannot resist drinking. I'd never intended to love him. I had tried hard to destroy all feelings of love for him, but now that I saw him again, I could not stop myself loving him. I compared him to the other gentlemen present. They were all fine, handsome men, but they did not have his power, his character, his strength, or indeed his deep laugh or his gentle smile. I felt that he and I were the same sort of person, that there was something in my brain and heart, in my blood and bone, that connected me to him forever. And although I knew I must hide my feelings, must never allow myself to hope, I also knew that while there was breath in my body, I would always love him. Just then I heard Blanche Ingram say to him, "Mr. Rochester, you should have sent that little girl, Adele, is that her name, to school. But I see you have a governess for her. I saw a strange little person with her just now. Has she gone?" "Oh, no, there she is on the window seat. It's very foolish of you, you know. Governesses aren't worth their salary, are they, Mamma?"
"My dear, don't mention governesses to me," cried Lady Ingram, holding a white hand to her forehead. "How I have suffered with them."
One of the older ladies whispered to her, pointing in my direction.
"Oh, I don't care if she hears me," said Lady Ingram. "All governesses are useless. They never teach children anything."
What fun we used to have playing tricks on them, didn't we, Mary? Laughed Blanche. But governesses are boring. Let's change the subject. Mr. Rochester, will you sing with me? With pleasure, he answered, bowing, and the group moved towards the piano. This was the moment for me to escape, but I'd only just left the sitting room and reached the hall when Mr. Rochester appeared through another door. "Come back, you're leaving too early," he said to me. "I'm tired, sir." He looked at me for a minute. "And a little depressed? Why?" "Tell me." "Nothing. It's nothing, sir. I'm not depressed." "But I think you are. You're almost crying. But I haven't got time now to discover the reason. Well, tonight you may leave early, but I want to see you with my guests every evening. Good night, my—" He stopped, bit his lip, and turned quickly away. Those were cheerful, busy days at Thornfield. The old house had never seen so much life and activity. When it was fine, the host and his guests went riding, visited places of interest, and walked in the gardens, and when it was wet, they played games indoors. Mr. Rochester and Blanche Ingram were always together. Observing them closely, I felt very sure that he would soon marry this fine lady. But I did not feel jealous, because I knew he did not love her. She had made every effort to attract him, but he had not given her his heart. I saw her faults very clearly. She was intelligent, but had no opinions of her own. She was beautiful, but not good. She spoke of feelings, but she knew nothing of sympathy or pity. And above all, she had her mother's pride and hardness. Other eyes apart from mine saw all these faults. Mr. Rochester himself knew she was not perfect, but he was clearly preparing to marry her, perhaps because she was of good family, perhaps for some other reason. One day when Mr. Rochester was out alone on business, a stranger arrived in a carriage and introduced himself as an old friend of the master's. His name was Mason, and he had just returned from the West Indies, where Mr. Rochester had once lived.